The year is 1816, and the southern African plains stretch endlessly beneath a sky, so wide it seems to swallow sound itself. The tall grass bends slowly in the wind, whispering across the earth as if the land is remembering something ancient. The air carries the metallic scent of blood and dust, and the silence that follows battle settles heavier than the clash that preceded it. On this open ground, where scattered shields lie half-buried and broken spears point toward the fading sun, a young warrior stands unmoving among the fallen. He is not celebrating victory. He is not shouting, nor does he display the restless energy common to men who have survived combat. Instead, he observes. His breathing is steady, his posture calm, his eyes fixed not on the bodies beneath his feet, but on the meaning of what has just happened. Around him lie warriors who fought according to the traditions passed down through generations. Men trained to throw their spears from a distance, to test courage through ritualized engagements, to retreat and regroup in battles that often produced more spectacle than decisive outcome. But this encounter was different. It was faster, quieter, and far more final. In his hand, the warrior grips a weapon unfamiliar to the expectations of the battlefield. It is shorter than the throwing spears scattered across the grass, heavier in the blade, built not for distance, but for intimacy. The weapon gleams as he tilts it slightly, catching the afternoon light before lowering it again. It is not merely a tool of war. It is an idea made tangible, a rejection of inherited methods and a declaration that the old ways are no longer sufficient. The warrior does not yet know that this weapon will one day terrify armies, nor that its design will alter the balance of power across an entire region. But he senses that something irreversible has begun. This battlefield does not mark the rise of a king born into authority. It marks the emergence of a man shaped by exclusion, humiliation, and relentless observation. The warrior standing here was not groomed for leadership in royal courts, nor celebrated in childhood as the heir to power. His life began on the margins, where legitimacy was questioned and belonging was uncertain. Those early experiences did not break him. They sharpened him. They taught him to watch closely, to endure silently, and to recognize weaknesses others accepted as natural truths. As he surveys the aftermath of the clash, his attention lingers not on the fallen enemies, but on the process that led to their defeat. He studies movement, timing, hesitation, the small failures that decide survival. For him, battle is not a test of bravery alone. It is a problem that can be analyzed, refined, and solved. The realization forming in his mind is simple yet radical. War does not need to follow tradition. It can be redesigned. The plains of southern Africa in the early 19th century were a landscape of shifting alliances and fragile coexistence. Clans lived in proximity, competing for grazing land, water, and cattle, the primary measure of wealth and survival. Warfare was frequent, but it often adhered to unwritten rules that limited its destructive potential. Engagements could be intense, yet they rarely aimed at complete annihilation. Prestige mattered. Displays of courage mattered. Survival and continuity mattered even more. Within this environment, the warrior, now standing among the fallen, begins to perceive war not as ritual, but as opportunity. He does not see chaos where others do. He sees patterns waiting to be reorganized. He sees warriors burdened by customs that prioritize honor over effectiveness. He sees weapons that encourage distance rather than decisive engagement. And most importantly, he sees that fear of breaking tradition is itself a vulnerability. The grass beneath his feet, stained by the encounter, becomes a silent witness to the moment a new philosophy takes root. One built on discipline, speed, and psychological dominance rather than inherited ceremony. The wind moves again, carrying distant sounds of survivors regrouping and the quiet murmurs of those tending to the wounded. Yet the warrior remains momentarily detached from a noise. His calm is not indifference, but calculation. Victory alone does not interest him. Understanding does. The encounter has confirmed what he has long suspected. that effectiveness belongs to those willing to abandon comfort and embrace transformation. Tradition, he realizes, is powerful not because it is correct, but because it is rarely questioned. In the years to come, this realization will evolve into a doctrine that reshapes military organization, weapon design, and the very identity of those who fight. But here, on this quiet field, it exists only as an unspoken conviction forming within a single mind. The warrior is young, still unknown beyond the circles of those who have fought beside him. Yet his stillness carries the weight of intention. He is not merely reacting to the present battle. He is imagining future ones. Conflicts fought with coordination rather than chaos, with unity rather than fragmented bravery. The sun continues its slow descent, casting elongated shadows across the field. The bodies will be removed, the grass will regrow, and the land will appear unchanged to those who pass by in the future. But the transformation that began here will not fade with the day. It will travel with the warrior as he walks away from the battlefield, carried not in trophies or spoils, but in ideas. Ideas about discipline that demands endurance beyond comfort. Ideas about loyalty directed towards something larger than clan identity. Ideas about fear, how it can be weaponized, controlled, and redirected. This moment also marks the emergence of a leadership style that differs from the chiefs and commanders who dominate the region. Many leaders inherit authority and maintain it through lineage or negotiation. This warrior, however, is driven by merit and effectiveness. His legitimacy will not come from birthright, but from results. Those who follow him will do so not merely because they are expected to, but because they recognize the clarity of his vision and the power of his methods. There is a quiet irony in the scene. The battlefield appears to represent destruction, yet it is also a place of creation. From the fallen emerges a strategy that will unite scattered groups into a cohesive force. From the silence emerges a reputation that will spread far beyond these plains. And from the calm posture of a solitary warrior emerges the foundation of a legacy that will challenge colonial observers, inspire allies, terrify enemies, and reshape the political landscape of Southern Africa. The young warrior finally moves, stepping away from the stillness and toward the uncertain future that awaits him. His spear remains in his hand, not raised in triumph, but carried with purpose. He walks not as a conqueror celebrating victory, but as a thinker leaving behind an experiment that has confirmed his suspicions. The old ways of war did not simply fail here. They were replaced. His name is Shaka, and although few on this battlefield can yet comprehend it, the transformation unfolding within him will extend far beyond individual battles. It will redefine power, challenge tradition, and set into motion a chain of events that will alter the destiny of countless communities. What began as a quiet realization on an open plain will become one of the most significant military and political revolutions in African history. Long before the battlefields, before the disciplined armies and the fear that would one day follow his name across vast distances, Shaka's story began in quiet controversy. Around the year 1787, in the rolling hills of what is now KwaZulu-Natal, a child entered the world under circumstances that immediately marked him as different. His father, Senzangakona, was a minor chief of the Zulu clan, a man with status but limited power in a region filled with competing leaders and shifting loyalties. His mother, Nandi, was not his formal wife. Their union had occurred outside the accepted customs of marriage, and in a society where lineage and legitimacy defined one's place in the world, this was more than a personal matter. It was a social stain. When news of Nandi's pregnancy spread, it did not bring celebration. Instead, it brought denial and ridicule. Elders dismissed the pregnancy as an illness, claiming that Nandi suffered from swelling caused by an intestinal beetle. The explanation was both an attempt to avoid scandal and a reflection of how deeply the situation threatened established norms. But when the child was born, the truth could not be hidden. The very name given to him, Shaka, is believed to have been linked to that earlier dismissal, a permanent reminder of the circumstances surrounding his birth. From his first moments, identity and shame were intertwined. Nandi's position became increasingly difficult. Without formal recognition as a wife, she and her child occupied an ambiguous and uncomfortable space within the community. What might have been tolerated quietly instead became a source of gossip and tension. Senzangakona's responsibilities as a chief required him to maintain stability and honor within his household, and the presence of an illegitimate child threatened both. Eventually, Nandi and her son were forced to leave, beginning a pattern of displacement that would define Shaka's early life. Exile is often imagined as a single dramatic departure, but for Shaka and Nandi, it was a prolonged experience of instability and uncertainty. They moved between communities, sometimes welcomed out of kinship ties, sometimes merely tolerated as dependents with little claim to belonging. Each relocation carried the same unspoken message: they were outsiders. Nandi bore the burden of protecting her child while navigating the humiliation of rejection, and Shaka grew up absorbing the emotional weight of that reality without fully understanding its origins. Childhood among other boys was particularly harsh. Children could be unforgiving mirrors of adult prejudice, and Shaka became an easy target for ridicule. He was mocked for his parentage, taunted for his lack of recognized status, and reminded constantly that he did not possess the security others took for granted. Insults about his legitimacy were not occasional. They were part of daily life, shaping his sense of identity in ways that would leave toggle marks long into adulthood. The experience of being defined by what he was not legitimate, not fully accepted, not secure, created a quiet but persistent internal tension. Physical hardship compounded emotional isolation. Life in displaced households meant limited access to resources and protection. Nandi struggled to provide stability, often relying on the goodwill of relatives or neighboring groups whose support could not be guaranteed. Food scarcity, social vulnerability, and the constant awareness of being dependent reinforced a reality where survival required resilience rather than comfort. For Shaka, childhood was less about innocence and more about adaptation. Yet adversity did not produce visible rebellion. Instead, it produced watchfulness. Shaka learned early that reacting openly to mockery only invited further humiliation. Silence became a form of defense, observation a form of empowerment. He began to study the people around him, not just the warriors who trained in open spaces, but the subtle hierarchies that determined who commanded respect and who did not. He watched how authority was performed, how confidence influenced perception, and how fear could silence opposition even without physical force. The contrast between his own vulnerability and the confidence of established warriors fascinated him. He observed their training rituals, their movements during practice, and the stories they shared about past encounters. These observations were not idle curiosity. They were attempts to understand the mechanics of power. Why were some individuals obeyed without question? What separated those who commanded respect from those who endured ridicule? These questions, forming quietly in a child's mind, would later shape the principles guiding his leadership. Nandi's influence during this period cannot be overstated. Despite her own suffering, she instilled in her son a sense of endurance that went beyond mere survival. She carried the memory of humiliation alongside the determination to ensure that it would not define their future. Her resilience became a living example for Shaka, demonstrating that dignity could persist even in circumstances designed to erase it. The bond between mother and son grew not out of comfort, but out of shared struggle, creating an emotional foundation that would remain central throughout his life. The instability of these early years also exposed Shaka to the broader dynamics of regional life. Movement between communities allowed him to witness different customs, leadership styles, and approaches to conflict. While many children grew up within the predictable boundaries of a single clan, Shaka experienced diversity born from displacement. This exposure broadened his understanding of social structures and reinforced the idea that identity was not fixed but constructed through loyalty, strength, and perception. Humiliation, however, remained a constant companion. Even moments of relative safety were overshadowed by the knowledge that acceptance could be withdrawn. The emotional impact of repeated rejection created a powerful internal drive, a desire not simply to belong, but to redefine the terms of belonging entirely. Rather than seeking validation within existing structures, Shaka began, consciously or not, to imagine a future where those structures could be reshaped. This psychological transformation was gradual and largely invisible to those around him. To observers, he was simply a quiet boy navigating hardship, occasionally withdrawn, occasionally intense. Few would have predicted that the same child who endured ridicule would one day command absolute loyalty from thousands. Yet the qualities that would later define him, emotional restraint, relentless focus, intolerance for weakness, and an acute awareness of social dynamics, were already forming beneath the surface. Exile did not end with a single departure. For Shaka and his mother, it became a recurring condition that shaped every stage of his early development. After leaving the Zulu homestead, they sought refuge among the Langini people, relatives of Nandi, who offered temporary shelter but never complete acceptance. The distinction between being welcomed and being tolerated was subtle, yet deeply felt. They were allowed to stay, to eat, and to exist within the community, but they were never fully absorbed into it. This lingering sense of conditional belonging created an environment where security felt fragile and temporary, as though it could disappear with a single disagreement or shift in circumstance. Life among the Langini was marked by quiet tension. Nandi carried the burden of proving her usefulness while navigating the whispers that followed her. Shaka, still a boy, absorbed these social undercurrents even when they were not spoken directly to him. Children repeated what they heard from adults, and the ridicule he had experienced earlier did not fade. Instead, it adapted to the new environment, reminding him daily that identity could be defined by the perceptions of others rather than by one's own understanding of self. Mockery, exclusion from games, and subtle reminders of his outsider status reinforced the lesson that acceptance was conditional and easily withdrawn. Yet exile also provided an education that could not have been gained within the comfort of a stable household. Displacement forced Shaka to observe rather than participate, to watch interactions from the margins instead of assuming his place within them. This vantage point sharpened his awareness of human behavior. He began noticing the unspoken rules governing respect, the way posture, confidence, and tone could influence how a person was treated regardless of birth. He saw how disputes were managed, how authority figures maintained control, and how fear could silence opposition even when strength alone was insufficient. Observation became both protection and preparation. Daily life involved practical responsibilities that demanded resilience. Shaka tended cattle, gathered firewood, and performed the routine tasks expected of boys within the community. These activities, while ordinary, exposed him to the rhythms of survival in a region where cattle represented wealth, security, and social standing. He learned the value of vigilance while herding, understanding that the loss of livestock could threaten an entire household's stability. This connection between resources and power would later influence his understanding of warfare, where capturing cattle could be as strategically significant as defeating enemies. Physical hardship also played a defining role. Walking long distances barefoot across uneven terrain toughened his body while reinforcing endurance as a necessity rather than a choice. Hunger, fatigue, and exposure to the elements were not exceptional experiences, but recurring realities. Instead of fostering resentment alone, these conditions cultivated tolerance for discomfort. Pain became familiar rather than frightening, an experience to be endured rather than avoided. This early conditioning would later allow him to impose demanding training regimens on soldiers because he had already lived through similar hardships himself. Despite these challenges, moments of curiosity and fascination emerged. The training grounds where warriors practiced offered glimpses into a world defined by discipline and purpose. From a distance, Shaka watched young men prepare for combat. their movements structured yet fluid, their interactions governed by hierarchy and respect. These scenes captivated him not because of the violence they implied, but because of the organization they revealed. Here was a space where status could be earned through effort, where strength and skill commanded recognition regardless of origin. For a boy denied automatic belonging, this was a powerful realization. His interest went beyond admiration. He began analyzing what he saw, questioning the effectiveness of traditional methods. The throwing spear, widely used in the region, struck him as impractical. Warriors hurled their primary weapon early in battle, often losing it and reducing themselves to defensive fighting or retreat. Engagements could become prolonged exchanges lacking decisive resolution. Even as a child, Shaka sensed inefficiencies in these practices. He wondered why combat relied so heavily on distance when proximity offered greater control over outcomes. These thoughts remained internal, unspoken questions forming quietly as he continued observing. The relationship between humiliation and determination deepened during this period. Each insult reinforced his awareness of vulnerability, yet also strengthened his resolve to redefine himself. Rather than seeking validation through confrontation, he developed emotional restraint. Anger, when expressed impulsively, often reinforced others' perceptions of weakness. Silence, however, created unpredictability. Those who mocked him could not easily gauge his reactions, and this uncertainty offered a subtle form of power. Emotional control became a tool, allowing him to endure without revealing the depth of his internal transformation. Nandi's struggles intensified the emotional complexity of exile. She navigated the dual roles of protector and outsider, striving to provide stability while confronting her own isolation. Her resilience served as both inspiration and pressure. Shaka understood that his actions reflected not only on himself, but on his mother's already fragile standing. This awareness fostered a sense of responsibility uncommon for someone his age. Protecting dignity became as important as physical survival, shaping his approach to relationships and conflict. Eventually, tensions within the Langini community reached a point where their presence became unsustainable. Support that had once been extended reluctantly began to erode, and Nandi and Shaka found themselves displaced once more. This second exile reinforced a painful truth. Belonging could be temporary even among relatives. The instability might have broken someone less resilient, but for Shaka, it solidified an emerging worldview. Security, he concluded, could not depend on the goodwill of others. It had to be constructed, defended, and controlled. Their wandering period exposed Shaka to new landscapes and communities, each with its own customs and hierarchies. Movement broadened his perspective, revealing both the similarities and differences among neighboring groups. Conflict, cooperation, and survival followed recognizable patterns regardless of location. This realization contributed to a growing belief that unity, if achieved, could create strength far greater than the fragmented existence he observed. The seeds of a broader vision began forming, though he could not yet articulate them fully. By the time Shaka and his mother found refuge among the Mthethwa, his life had already been shaped by instability, hardship, and quiet determination. Yet this new environment marked a turning point unlike any he had experienced before. Under the leadership of Dingiswayo, the Mthethwa Confederation was not simply another community offering temporary shelter. It was a political and military system with structure, discipline, and vision. For the first time in Shaka's life, he encountered a society where organization and leadership extended beyond survival and into deliberate statecraft. This exposure would fundamentally alter the trajectory of his future. Dingiswayo himself was an unusual leader for his time. While many chiefs focused primarily on cattle wealth and localized authority, Dingiswayo pursued broader alliances, diplomacy, and military organization. His confederation united multiple groups under a loose but functional political framework, emphasizing cooperation as a means of strengthening collective security. Warfare still existed, but it was increasingly guided by strategic considerations rather than spontaneous raids or ritualized clashes. To a young man like Shaka, who had spent years observing fragmented communities struggling for stability, this model of coordinated power was both impressive and inspiring. The Mthethwa also maintained a more organized military structure than most neighboring groups. Young men were gathered into age-based regiments, trained collectively, and expected to develop not only fighting ability, but loyalty to the larger political entity. This system offered something Shaka had never truly experienced before: purpose. Instead of existing on the margins, he was now part of a defined group with shared responsibilities and expectations. The regiment became more than a training ground. It became a source of identity. Joining the Mthethwa military marked the beginning of Shaka's transformation from observer to participant. The routines were demanding and left little room for hesitation. Days began early, often with physical conditioning that pushed endurance beyond comfort. Running across uneven terrain, carrying equipment, and engaging in repeated drills were not optional exercises, but essential preparations for survival and conflict. For someone who had already endured hardship during exile, these demands were familiar rather than intimidating. The discipline required of the regiment resonated with the resilience he had developed through necessity. Yet Shaka did not immediately stand out for physical dominance alone. While capable and determined, he was not initially recognized as the strongest or fastest among his peers. What distinguished him was his intensity of focus. He approached training not as routine obligation, but as an opportunity to understand the mechanics of combat. Every drill became a lesson, every mistake an insight. He watched how warriors coordinated movements, how hesitation disrupted formation, and how confidence influenced the morale of others. This analytical approach set him apart, even if it was not always openly acknowledged. The regiment environment also exposed Shaka to a new form of social belonging. Unlike clan-based identity, which he had experienced as exclusionary, regimental membership was built on shared effort and mutual dependence. Success in training required cooperation, and survival in battle depended on trust. This collective dynamic offered a sense of inclusion that did not rely on birth or lineage. It demonstrated that loyalty could be constructed through shared experience rather than inherited status, a realization that would later shape his approach to building unity across diverse groups. Dingiswayo's leadership style further influenced Shaka's development. The chief valued competence and recognized potential in individuals regardless of their origins. Stories of Shaka's dedication and effectiveness eventually reached Dingiswayo, who took an interest in the young warrior's progress. This attention was significant, not merely as recognition, but as validation of merit over background. For Shaka, who had spent his childhood defined by illegitimacy, acknowledgement from a respected leader carried profound psychological weight. It reinforced the belief that authority could be earned through ability and commitment. Within the regiment, Shaka's curiosity about combat methods intensified. He began questioning the reliance on throwing spears as primary weapons, observing how warriors often lost their main advantage early in battle. Engagements frequently devolved into chaotic encounters where success depended on luck as much as skill. These inefficiencies frustrated him, particularly when contrasted with the disciplined training environment he had come to value. He started experimenting privately with alternative approaches, focusing on close combat techniques that emphasize control, precision, and sustained effectiveness. This experimentation extended beyond weapon use to physical conditioning and mental preparation. Shaka pushed himself to endure discomfort intentionally, practicing movements repeatedly until they became instinctive. He trained his body to remain functional under fatigue and his mind to remain calm under pressure. The regiment environment allowed space for such dedication, even if others did not fully understand the motivations behind it. What appeared as relentless intensity to some was, for Shaka, preparation for a future he could already sense but not yet fully articulate. Battle experience soon followed, providing opportunities to test these observations in real conflict. Serving under Mthethwa command, Shaka participated in campaigns that exposed him to the realities of warfare beyond training exercises. The fear, confusion, and unpredictability of combat confirmed many of his earlier suspicions about traditional methods. He witnessed how formations broke under pressure, how thrown weapons left warriors vulnerable, and how morale could shift rapidly depending on leadership and coordination. These experiences reinforced his belief that war could be approached more systematically. Despite the violence inherent in these encounters, Shaka's reputation began to grow. He was noted not simply for bravery, but for effectiveness, a quality that combined composure, decisiveness, and adaptability. Fellow warriors recognized his ability to remain focused amid chaos, while superiors observed his reliability in executing orders. Respect developed gradually, not through dramatic displays, but through consistent performance. For someone who had once struggled for basic acceptance, this respect represented a significant transformation. The regiment also fostered competition, encouraging warriors to distinguish themselves through skill and dedication. Shaka thrived in this environment, viewing competition not as hostility, but as motivation. He measured himself against peers, identifying areas for improvement and striving to exceed expectations. This drive was not solely about personal recognition. It reflected a deeper desire to overcome the limitations imposed by his early life. Each success within the regiment symbolized a step away from the identity of the outcast. Years of service within the Mthethwa Confederation exposed Shaka to a reality few warriors paused to question. Battle was everywhere, yet its purpose often seemed strangely limited. Raids were conducted to seize cattle, assert prestige, or resolve disputes, but rarely to achieve decisive transformation. Victories were celebrated, defeats endured, and then life resumed along familiar lines. Warfare functioned almost like ritual, a recurring performance governed by expectations rather than strategic necessity. For many, this system was acceptable. It maintained balance without threatening the continuity of communities. For Shaka, however, the more he observed, the more he felt that something fundamental was being wasted. Participation in multiple campaigns allowed him to witness patterns that others dismissed as normal. Warriors would advance cautiously, hurl their throwing spears, and then withdraw or engage in scattered close combat. Casualties occurred, but complete destruction of an enemy was uncommon. Battles could stretch over long periods without clear resolution, leaving both sides weakened, yet still capable of continuing conflict later. This cycle of limited engagement frustrated Shaka. He began to see warfare not as an inevitable expression of tradition, but as an inefficient process lacking clarity of objective. His frustration did not stem from a love of violence, but from an emerging strategic perspective. If conflict was unavoidable, he believed it should produce decisive outcomes. Half measures prolonged instability, allowing rival groups to recover and perpetuate cycles of retaliation. A decisive victory, though harsher, could create conditions for lasting control and unity. This line of thinking was dangerous in a cultural context where restraint in warfare had social value. Yet Shaka's experiences of exile and insecurity had already taught him that vulnerability often resulted from hesitation. Efficiency, even when brutal, offered a form of stability. The more he reflected on these ideas, the more he began to treat warfare as a problem requiring solutions rather than as a tradition requiring preservation. He analyzed the mechanics of combat with almost scientific curiosity. How did formations influence morale? Why did some warriors maintain cohesion while others scattered? What role did fear play in determining the outcome of engagements? These questions occupied his thoughts during moments of rest, transforming each campaign into an opportunity for study as much as participation. Weaponry became a central focus of his analysis. The long throwing spear, widely accepted as the primary instrument of combat, represented both cultural identity and practical limitation. Warriors often carried multiple spears, casting them from a distance before closing in with clubs or engaging in chaotic grappling. Once the spears were thrown, their advantage disappeared, leaving fighters vulnerable. Shaka saw this as a critical flaw. A weapon that was effective only once could not sustain dominance throughout the duration of battle. He began experimenting privately with shorter spears designed for repeated use in close combat, imagining a form of fighting that emphasized control rather than chance. This experimentation was not limited to equipment. Shaka's understanding of movement and coordination evolved alongside his ideas about weapons. He noticed how scattered advances allowed enemies opportunities to regroup and counterattack. Cohesion, he realized, could amplify individual strength into collective power. Warriors acting in unison created psychological pressure that exceeded the sum of their physical capabilities. The idea that discipline could magnify effectiveness became one of his most significant insights. It suggested that victory was less about individual heroism and more about collective precision. Shaka's perspective on fear also began to shift. Many warriors treated fear as an emotion to be hidden or overcome through displays of bravery. Shaka approached it differently. He recognized fear as a predictable human response that could be manipulated strategically. A force that moved decisively, maintained formation, and demonstrated relentless momentum could instill fear in opponents before physical engagement even occurred. Psychological dominance, he concluded, could reduce the need for prolonged combat by undermining enemy morale from the outset. This understanding would later influence his emphasis on speed, coordination, and overwhelming presence on the battlefield. His experiences within Dingiswayo's military structure reinforced these developing ideas. The Mthethwa Confederation already valued organization and discipline more than many neighboring groups, providing a foundation upon which Shaka's thoughts could build. Yet he sensed that even this system did not fully exploit its potential. Training improved cohesion, but traditional assumptions about warfare still constrained innovation. Shaka began to imagine what might be possible if discipline were extended beyond preparation into every aspect of combat. If formations were drilled until instinctive, if endurance replaced caution, and if the objective of battle shifted from demonstration to domination. These reflections gradually formed a broader vision linking warfare to political transformation. Shaka realized that decisive military power could do more than secure victory. It could reshape social structures. Fragmented clans remained vulnerable to external threats and internal disputes precisely because their military capabilities were limited and inconsistent. A force capable of overwhelming opposition could unify these groups under a centralized authority, reducing conflict within the unified entity while projecting strength outward. War, in this sense, became not merely destructive but transformative, a mechanism for creating order where fragmentation had prevailed. The concept of assimilation further distinguished his thinking from conventional approaches. Rather than viewing defeated groups solely as enemies to be punished or resources to be exploited, he began considering the strategic advantages of integration. Absorbing warriors, resources, and knowledge from conquered communities could strengthen the victor while reducing the likelihood of future resistance. Unity achieved through assimilation would be more stable than unity maintained through subjugation alone. This perspective reflected both practicality and an awareness of his own experiences as an outsider seeking belonging. Shaka's personal history played a crucial role in shaping these ideas. Having experienced rejection and displacement, he understood the vulnerabilities of fragmented identity. He recognized how individuals and groups sought security within structures that offered recognition and purpose. A centralized military system, if combined with opportunities for advancement based on merit, could provide that sense of belonging while reinforcing loyalty. The regiment, rather than the clan, could become the primary unit of identity, creating bonds that transcended traditional divisions. As these thoughts matured, Shaka's demeanor on the battlefield began to reflect his evolving philosophy. The year 1816 marked more than the death of a chief. It marked the opening of an opportunity that Shaka had been unconsciously preparing for throughout his life. When news arrived that his father, Sinzangakona, had died, the event carried complex meaning for Shaka. For most sons, the death of a father would bring grief, reflection, and perhaps the expectation of inheritance. For Shaka, the emotions were layered with memories of rejection, exile, and the distant presence of a father whose recognition had been limited and whose household had never truly been his home. Yet beyond personal feelings, Shaka recognized something far more significant. The death of Sinzangakona created a political vacuum within the Zulu clan, and in that vacuum lay the possibility of transformation. At the time, the Zulu were not a dominant force in the region. They were a relatively small clan, numbering only a few thousand people and occupying modest territory. Their position within the broader political landscape was defined largely by their relationship to stronger neighbors, particularly the Mthethwa Confederation under Dingiswayo. The Zulu were not insignificant, but neither were they powerful. Leadership of such a community might have been considered an honor by some, yet it offered limited prospects for influence. For Shaka, however, the size of the clan was not a limitation. It was an advantage. A small community could be reshaped more rapidly than a large one entrenched in tradition. According to established custom, succession did not favor Shaka. The position of chief passed to Sigajana, Sinzangakona's recognized heir, whose legitimacy was unquestioned within the clan's hierarchy. Shaka's status as an illegitimate son placed him outside the traditional line of authority. Under normal circumstances, this would have ended any possibility of leadership. But Shaka's life had rarely followed normal expectations. Years spent within Dingiswayo's military had provided him with something more valuable than formal legitimacy: experience, reputation, and the support of a powerful patron. Dingiswayo's backing was decisive. Recognizing Shaka's capability and loyalty, the Mthethwa leader viewed him as a useful ally whose leadership of the Zulu could strengthen the Confederation's influence. The precise details of how power shifted remain blurred by oral histories and differing accounts, but the outcome is clear. Sigajana's rule was brief, and within months he was dead. Whether through direct action by Shaka, intervention by supporters, or a combination of political maneuvering and conflict, the result was the same. Shaka emerged as chief of the Zulu. Assuming leadership did not bring immediate celebration or stability, Shaka inherited a clan shaped by tradition, accustomed to decentralized authority, and unprepared for the radical changes he envisioned. Many within the community likely saw him as an unconventional choice, a man whose childhood had been marked by exile, now occupying a position of authority. Yet Shaka did not seek acceptance through reassurance or gradual adjustment. The moment he secured power, he began dismantling the structures he believed limited the clan's potential. One of his first priorities was the reorganization of the military system. Traditionally, Zulu warriors followed an age-based pattern of service that allowed young men to train and fight together before eventually returning to civilian life, marrying, and focusing on agricultural responsibilities. While this system maintained social continuity, Shaka viewed it as inefficient. Warriors divided between domestic obligations and military duties could not achieve the level of discipline required for decisive warfare. To him, part-time soldiers represented vulnerability rather than strength. Shaka replaced this model with the concept of a standing army. Young men were grouped into permanent regiments and required to live within military settlements where training, discipline, and loyalty became central to daily life. Marriage was postponed until warriors demonstrated commitment and effectiveness in service, ensuring that personal ambitions did not distract from collective objectives. This policy was controversial as it disrupted established social rhythms, but created a force whose identity was rooted in military cohesion rather than clan ties. Living within barracks transformed the relationship between warriors and leadership. Instead of returning to homesteads where familial loyalties dominated, soldiers remained immersed in an environment where the state, embodied by Shaka, became the primary focus of allegiance. Daily drills reinforced unity, while shared hardships strengthened bonds between individuals from different backgrounds. This arrangement also allowed Shaka to maintain direct oversight, ensuring that discipline was consistent and that loyalty remained centralized. Reorganization extended beyond structure to mindset. Shaka emphasized endurance as a defining characteristic of his warriors. Training pushed physical limits, requiring barefoot movement across harsh terrain, extended periods without food or water, and repeated practice of formations until responses became instinctive. The objective was not merely physical strength, but psychological resilience. Warriors needed to function under stress, ignore discomfort, and trust their comrades implicitly. This emphasis on mental conditioning distinguished Shaka's approach from traditional preparation, where courage was often celebrated without systematic development. Authority within the reorganized system operated through a combination of fear and respect. Shaka demanded absolute obedience, and failure carried severe consequences. Punishments for cowardice or disobedience were public and uncompromising, reinforcing the seriousness of expectations. Yet alongside these harsh measures existed opportunities for advancement based on merit. Warriors who distinguished themselves through skill and dedication received recognition, privileges, and eventual permission to marry. This balance of discipline and reward created motivation that extended beyond fear alone. Shaka's reforms also began reshaping the broader identity of the Zulu people. Clan loyalty, once the primary source of belonging, gradually gave way to regimental affiliation. Individuals from different backgrounds trained and fought together, forming bonds that transcended traditional divisions. The regiment became both a military unit and a social structure, offering status, purpose, and community. This transformation reduced internal fragmentation while strengthening collective identity, laying the foundation for a more unified state. The psychological impact of these changes was profound. Warriors who had previously fought as representatives of their families or local groups now saw themselves as participants in a larger project. The concept of the Zulu as a nation, rather than merely a clan, began to take shape. This shift was subtle but significant, as it redefined the meaning of loyalty and expanded the scope of ambition. Shaka was not simply leading a community. He was constructing a new form of political organization centered on discipline and cohesion. One of the most defining moments in Shaka's transformation of the Zulu military did not begin with a massive battle or political conquest. It began with a weapon, a simple but revolutionary redesign that reflected his broader philosophy of warfare. The traditional throwing spear had dominated combat across the region for generations. It was a symbol of warrior identity, a tool embedded in ritual and practice. Warriors carried several of these long, slender spears into battle, hurling them toward the enemy before engaging in close combat with clubs or shields. The method was familiar, accepted, and rarely questioned. Yet to Shaka, it represented everything he believed was flawed about traditional warfare. The throwing spear encouraged distance and hesitation. Once released, the warrior was left without his primary weapon, often reducing combat to chaotic exchanges where skill mattered less than chance. The act of throwing also created psychological separation between combatants, turning battle into a contest of intimidation rather than decisive engagement. Shaka saw this as inefficient and dangerously limiting. He believed that victory should not depend on a single throw or the randomness of projectile success. Instead, it should rely on sustained control, proximity, and the ability to repeatedly strike with precision. From this dissatisfaction emerged the development of a new weapon, shorter, heavier, and designed specifically for stabbing. This spear, later known as the Ikuwa, featured a broad blade and a sturdy shaft that allowed warriors to maintain possession of their weapon throughout the fight. Its purpose was not intimidation from afar, but lethal effectiveness at close range. The name itself, often associated with the sound produced when the blade was withdrawn from a wound, captured the intimate and final nature of the combat style it represented. The weapon was not simply a modification of existing tools. It was a declaration that warfare itself would be redefined. Introducing such a radical change required more than forging new blades. It demanded a shift in mindset. Warriors trained for years in the art of throwing spears needed to abandon habits deeply ingrained in both technique and identity. Shaka approached this challenge with characteristic determination. He emphasized the advantages of retaining one's weapon, demonstrating how close combat allowed for greater control over outcomes. He also linked the use of the Ikuwa to a broader concept of courage, not the symbolic bravery of distant engagement, but the controlled bravery required to confront an opponent directly. The adoption of the Ikuwa naturally led to changes in shield use. Traditional shields have been employed primarily for defense, protecting warriors from thrown weapons before allowing for cautious advances. Under Shaka's evolving doctrine, shields became instruments of offense as well as defense. Warriors were trained to use their shields to hook, push, and destabilize opponents, creating openings for decisive strikes with the spear. This integration of shield and spear transformed individual combat into a coordinated system of movement and timing, emphasizing technique over brute force. Weapon innovation alone, however, could not produce the disciplined army Shaka envisioned. He understood that tools were only as effective as the individuals wielding them. As a result, he intensified the training regimen that had already begun to reshape Zulu military life. Physical endurance became a defining expectation. Warriors were required to run long distances barefoot across harsh terrain, toughening their feet and developing stamina that allowed rapid movement during campaigns. The discomfort was intentional, preparing soldiers to operate effectively under conditions that would exhaust less disciplined forces. Training extended beyond physical endurance to psychological conditioning. Warriors practiced maintaining formation under stress, responding to commands instantly, and suppressing individual impulses that could disrupt collective action. Mock battles simulated the chaos of real combat, forcing soldiers to adapt while preserving cohesion. Mistakes were corrected harshly, reinforcing the seriousness of expectations and the consequences of hesitation. The goal was to create fighters who could function as parts of a coordinated whole rather than as isolated individuals driven by personal instinct. Hydration and rest were deliberately limited during certain training exercises, pushing warriors to endure fatigue without compromising performance. These measures were not acts of cruelty for their own sake, but methods of cultivating resilience. Shaka believed that an army capable of enduring discomfort without complaint would possess a decisive advantage over opponents reliant on comfort and routine. Endurance became a source of psychological strength, instilling confidence that they could outlast and outmaneuver adversaries. Discipline under Shaka's system operated through a combination of fear and pride. Severe punishments reinforced obedience, ensuring that commands were followed without hesitation. Public consequences for failure demonstrated that weakness could endanger the entire unit, not just the individual responsible. Yet alongside these harsh measures, Shaka cultivated a sense of identity and honor within regiments. Warriors were encouraged to take pride in their discipline, viewing themselves as members of an elite force distinguished by their commitment and effectiveness. Regimental identity became intertwined with the use of the Ikuwa. Mastery of the weapon symbolized belonging within the new military order. Training sessions emphasized coordinated advances, synchronized strikes, and the seamless integration of shield and spear techniques. Warriors developed confidence not only in their individual abilities, but in the reliability of their comrades. This mutual trust reduced fear during close engagement, as each fighter understood that he was supported by those beside him. Shaka also recognized the psychological impact his innovations would have on enemies. A force trained to close distance rapidly and engage with lethal precision could create panic among opponents accustomed to slower, ritualized combat. The sight of disciplined warriors advancing in formation, shields locked and spears poised for immediate use, generated a sense of inevitability that often weakened resistance before physical contact occurred. Psychological dominance, once an abstract concept in Shaka's thinking, now manifested visibly on the battlefield. The Ikawa represented more than a tactical advantage. It embodied Shaka's philosophy of decisiveness. By encouraging direct engagement, the weapon eliminated prolonged uncertainty. Battles fought with such methods tended to reach resolution quickly, reducing opportunities for enemy regrouping. This efficiency aligned with Shaka's broader objective of transforming warfare into a tool capable of producing lasting outcomes rather than temporary victories. The weapon became a physical expression of his belief that hesitation prolonged instability. With the introduction of new weapons and the transformation of training methods, Shaka's military reforms began to reveal their full potential on the battlefield. Yet weapons and discipline alone could not guarantee dominance. Shaka understood that victory depended not only on individual bravery or superior equipment, but on coordination, movement, and the ability to manipulate the flow of battle itself. From this understanding emerged one of his most influential innovations, a tactical formation that would become synonymous with Zulu warfare and feared across the region: the horns of the buffalo. The concept behind the formation was deceptively simple, but its execution required extraordinary discipline. Shaka envisioned the army not as a mass of warriors charging independently, but as a living structure composed of distinct parts working toward a single objective. The formation divided forces into multiple components, each assigned a specific role that contributed to the overall strategy. The chest, made up of experienced and resilient warriors, would engage the enemy directly, drawing attention and absorbing the initial impact of combat. Meanwhile, the horns, consisting of younger and faster soldiers, would move along the flanks, sweeping around the sides with the objective of encircling the enemy from behind. Behind these elements stood the loins, a reserve force prepared to reinforce weak points, pursue fleeing enemies, or exploit emerging opportunities. This structure transformed battle from a straightforward confrontation into a carefully orchestrated maneuver. Opponents facing the Zulu often perceived the chest as the primary threat, focusing their energy on resisting the direct advance. By the time they recognized the movement of the horns, their ability to react was already compromised. Encirclement produced both physical and psychological pressure, trapping opponents and undermining morale as escape routes disappeared. The presence of a disciplined reserve ensured that momentum could be maintained even if unexpected resistance occurred. The formation allowed Shaka's forces to impose their will on the battlefield, dictating not only how the fight unfolded, but how it ended. Training warriors to execute this formation required relentless repetition. Movements had to be coordinated across distances, with each component understanding its role and trusting others to fulfill theirs. Communication was conveyed through signals, rhythm, and experience rather than complex verbal commands, enabling the formation to function even amid the chaos of combat. The physical endurance cultivated through Shaka's training methods became essential, as the horns often needed to run significant distances at high speed to achieve successful encirclement. Without discipline and stamina, the formation would collapse into disorder. With them, it became devastatingly effective. The first campaigns in which this formation was employed demonstrated its power. Shaka targeted smaller neighboring clans that had previously regarded the Zulu as equals or even inferiors. These groups were accustomed to traditional patterns of engagement, expecting battles characterized by cautious advances and limited objectives. Instead, they encountered coordinated assaults that moved with unsettling precision. The chest engaged directly, maintaining pressure without overextending, while the horns swept around terrain features, exploiting gaps and creating the sensation of being surrounded long before physical encirclement was complete. Speed played a crucial role in these engagements. Shaka emphasized rapid mobilization and surprise, often launching attacks at dawn when opponents were least prepared. Scouts gathered information on terrain and enemy positioning, allowing the formation to adapt to specific conditions. Hills, valleys, and open plains were not obstacles, but opportunities for maneuver. Warriors learned to move as a unified force, adjusting their pace and direction according to signals rather than individual impulse. The psychological effect of such coordination was profound. Opponents who expected disorganized clashes found themselves confronting an army that behaved more like a single organism than a collection of individuals. When resistance collapsed, Shaka's objectives extended beyond immediate victory. He did not pursue conquest solely for resources or prestige. Instead, he sought assimilation. Defeated clans were given a choice: submit and become part of the Zulu state or face destruction. Submission did not necessarily entail humiliation. Young men from conquered groups were incorporated into regiments, trained alongside existing warriors, and granted opportunities to earn status through service. Chiefs often retained local authority under Shaka's oversight, maintaining continuity while aligning loyalty with the expanding Zulu structure. This approach strengthened the army while reducing the likelihood of future rebellion. Assimilation also reinforced the effectiveness of the Buffalo Horns formation. Newly incorporated warriors contributed knowledge of local terrain, customs, and neighboring groups, enhancing strategic awareness. The mixing of individuals from different backgrounds within regiments weakened traditional clan divisions and replaced them with shared military identity. Over time, warriors began to identify more strongly with their regiments and the Zulu state than with their original communities. This shift in identity created cohesion that extended beyond battlefield tactics, supporting Shaka's broader project of unification. Early victories fueled momentum. Each successful campaign increased the size of the army, expanded territorial influence, and enhanced Shaka's reputation. Stories of rapid encirclement and decisive defeat spread across neighboring regions, shaping perceptions even before direct encounters occurred. Fear became an ally, discouraging resistance and encouraging voluntary submission. Some groups chose to align themselves with the Zulu rather than risk confrontation, recognizing the advantages of joining a force that appeared unstoppable. The Buffalo Horns formation was not rigidly applied, but adapted to circumstances. Shaka encouraged flexibility, training commanders to adjust roles according to terrain and enemy behavior. On open plains, the horns could sweep widely, enveloping entire forces. In constrained environments, the formation compressed, using terrain to restrict enemy movement while maintaining pressure. The reserve element provided adaptability, reinforcing success or preventing collapse, depending on the situation. This flexibility distinguished Shaka's tactics from rigid traditional approaches, allowing innovation to respond to evolving challenges. Despite the effectiveness of these campaigns, they were not without cost. Rapid expansion and assimilation created logistical challenges, requiring the distribution of resources, management of diverse populations, and maintenance of discipline across growing ranks. Shaka addressed these issues through strict organization and centralized authority, ensuring that military success translated into political stability. For years, Shaka's rise had unfolded under the shadow of Dingiswayo's protection. The Mthethwa Confederation provided not only a political framework, but a shield that allowed Shaka to develop his reforms without facing overwhelming opposition. Dingiswayo was more than an ally. He was a mentor whose broader vision of unity and structured power had helped shape Shaka's own thinking. As long as the Confederation remained intact, Shaka's ambitions could grow within a relatively stable environment. But stability in southern Africa during this period was fragile, and the death of Dingiswayo would shatter that balance, forcing Shaka into a role he could no longer approach cautiously. The conflict that led to Dingiswayo's downfall involved one of the region's most formidable rivals, Zwaide, leader of Ndwandwe. Zwaide commanded a powerful force with deep military tradition and extensive resources. His authority rivaled that of the Mthethwa, and tensions between the two powers had simmered for years. Competition for influence, territory, and allegiance among smaller groups created a volatile landscape in which confrontation seemed inevitable. When conflict finally escalated, it did so with consequences far beyond a single battle. Dingiswayo's capture and execution by Zwide sent shockwaves across the region. The leader who had held a delicate alliance together was suddenly gone, leaving the Confederation without the unifying authority that had sustained it. The Mthethwa structure, dependent on Dingiswayo's personal leadership, fragmented rapidly. Clans that had once cooperated began prioritizing their own survival, withdrawing support and reconsidering loyalties. The political environment shifted from cautious cooperation to uncertainty and opportunism almost overnight. For Shaka, the loss was both personal and strategic. Dingiswayo had provided protection, guidance, and legitimacy during the formative years of Shaka's leadership. His death removed a stabilizing influence and exposed Shaka to threats that had previously been contained. At the same time, the collapse of the Confederation created a vacuum of power. Where once Shaka had operated as a subordinate ally, he now stood as an independent leader with both the freedom and the responsibility to act decisively. The question was no longer whether he could expand his influence, but whether he could survive in an environment suddenly dominated by stronger, more aggressive rivals. Rather than retreat into defensive caution, Shaka moved with calculated urgency. He understood that hesitation would invite attack, particularly from Zwide, whose ambitions extended across the same territory Shaka sought to consolidate. The fragmentation of the Mthethwa alliance left many smaller groups vulnerable and uncertain, searching for protection or leadership. Shaka recognized an opportunity to absorb these remnants, transforming instability into strength. Some groups joined willingly, perceiving the disciplined Zulu army as their best chance for security. Others resisted, unwilling to submit to a leader whose power had grown so rapidly. Those who resisted encountered the full force of Shaka's evolving military system. The absorption of former Mthethwa allies expanded Shaka's resources and manpower significantly. Warriors trained under Dingiswayo's system brought valuable experience, while their integration into Zulu regiments reinforced the shift from clan identity to centralized loyalty. Each incorporation strengthened Shaka's position, allowing him to field larger forces while reducing the number of independent groups capable of opposing him. The process was not merely conquest, but consolidation, transforming scattered allies into components of a unified military structure. Yet the greatest challenge remained Zwide and the Ndwandwe. Unlike smaller clans, the Ndwandwe represented a formidable opponent with substantial numbers and established reputation. A direct confrontation without preparation would have been disastrous. Shaka understood that victory required more than bravery or numerical parity. It required strategic innovation. The Ndwandwe expected warfare to follow recognizable patterns, where armies met openly and tested strength through direct engagement. Shaka chose instead to redefine the conditions under which battle would occur. One of his most significant strategic decisions involved the deliberate use of scorched earth tactics. As Ndwandwe forces advanced, expecting resistance and opportunities to sustain themselves through captured resources, they encountered abandoned settlements and depleted supplies. Shaka ordered the evacuation of communities and the removal or destruction of food stores, denying the enemy access to provisions. This approach was unconventional and risky, as it temporarily disrupted the lives of his own people. Yet it served a critical purpose, weakening the Ndwandwe before decisive engagement even began. The psychological impact of this strategy was substantial. Ndwandwe warriors marching through empty territory faced hunger, fatigue, and uncertainty. The absence of visible opposition created frustration, while stretched supply lines undermined morale. Shaka scouts monitored these movements carefully, gathering intelligence on enemy positioning and condition. Rather than seeking immediate confrontation, Shaka allowed time and environment to erode the Ndwandwe's advantage. War, in this instance, became as much about patience and endurance as about combat. When Shaka finally chose to engage, he did so on ground that favored his forces. He selected terrain that limited the Ndwandwe's ability to maneuver effectively, forcing them into positions where their numerical superiority could not be fully utilized. Elevated positions and constrained approaches allowed the Zulu to maintain formation and exploit the discipline developed through rigorous training. The battlefield was no longer a neutral space, but an environment shaped by deliberate preparation. The confrontation that followed tested the full extent of Shaka's innovations. The buffalo horns formation, refined through earlier campaigns, was adapted to the terrain and circumstances of this larger conflict. The chest held the Ndwandwe's attention, absorbing their initial momentum while maintaining cohesion. The horns moved strategically along flanks, exploiting gaps created by fatigue and disorganization. The reserve provided flexibility, reinforcing pressure and preventing opportunities for recovery. The combination of terrain advantage, disciplined movement, and enemy exhaustion created conditions in which the Ndwandwe struggled to respond effectively. The battle's outcome marked a turning point in regional power dynamics. The Ndwandwe, previously perceived as dominant, were forced into retreat after sustaining heavy losses. Their reputation for invincibility was shattered, while Shaka's standing rose dramatically. Victory against such a formidable opponent demonstrated that his reforms were not merely effective against smaller groups, but capable of challenging established powers. The psychological effect extended beyond immediate participants, influencing how neighboring communities perceive the balance of power. Military success alone could not sustain the transformation Shaka envisioned. Victories on a battlefield created opportunities, but without internal cohesion, expansion would only produce a fragile collection of conquered communities prone to rebellion and fragmentation. Shaka understood that lasting power required more than military dominance. It required a redefinition of identity, loyalty, and social structure. The challenge before him was not simply to command warriors, but to reshape an entire society so that unity would persist even in the absence of immediate conflict. One of the most radical elements of Shaka's approach involved weakening the traditional clan-based loyalties that had long defined social organization. For generations, identity had been rooted in kinship, with allegiance directed first toward family and clan leaders. While this structure provided stability within small communities, it also created barriers to broader unity. Clans maintained distinct interests, rivalries, and obligations that could undermine centralized authority. Shaka saw these divisions as vulnerabilities that limited the potential for collective strength. To address this, he deliberately reorganized the composition of his military regiments. Instead of allowing individuals from the same clan to remain together, he dispersed them across different units. Warriors who might once have relied on familial bonds now found themselves living and training alongside individuals from diverse backgrounds. This mixing disrupted existing loyalties while fostering new ones based on shared experience and mutual dependence. The regiment became not merely a military formation, but a social institution where identity was reconstructed around collective purpose. Life within the regimental settlements reinforced this transformation. Warriors lived together for extended periods, sharing daily routines that emphasized discipline, cooperation, and endurance. Training, ceremonies, and campaigns created experiences that transcended clan affiliation, replacing inherited identity with earned belonging. The sense of brotherhood formed through shared hardship proved powerful, encouraging individuals to prioritize regimental honor over familial allegiance. Over time, this shift contributed to the emergence of a broader Zulu identity that encompassed multiple communities under a unified framework. Shaka's policies regarding marriage further supported this restructuring. Young men were often prohibited from marrying until they had demonstrated loyalty and effectiveness through military service. This policy served multiple purposes. It delayed the formation of independent households that might compete for attention and resources, ensuring that warriors remained focused on their regimental responsibilities. It also positioned the state as a mediator of personal advancement, reinforcing the perception that loyalty and achievement were prerequisites for social recognition. Marriage, traditionally a private milestone, became intertwined with public service and state approval. The centralization of authority extended beyond the military into the governance of conquered territories. Chiefs who submitted to Shaka were frequently allowed to retain local roles, but their autonomy was limited by the expectation of loyalty to the broader Zulu state. Tribute, participation in military campaigns, and adherence to centralized directives became conditions of continued authority. This approach balanced continuity with control, enabling local leadership to function while preventing the reemergence of independent power centers capable of challenging Shaka's rule. Administrative oversight was strengthened through the establishment of royal settlements that functioned as political and military hubs. These settlements housed regiments, advisors, and members of the royal household, creating spaces where decisions could be coordinated and authority visibly reinforced. They also served as symbols of centralized power, demonstrating the scale and organization of the emerging state. The presence of such settlements across key areas allowed Shaka to maintain influence over distant territories while facilitating communication and resource distribution. The integration of conquered peoples into the Zulu system reflected both pragmatism and strategic vision. Rather than enslaving or marginalizing defeated groups, Shaka pursued assimilation as a means of strengthening his state. Young men were incorporated into regiments, where they could earn status through service regardless of origin. This approach reduced resentment while transforming potential adversaries into contributors. It also expanded the pool of talent and knowledge available to the army, enhancing its adaptability and effectiveness. Cultural practices played a significant role in reinforcing unity. Ceremonies, dances, and displays of military discipline created shared experiences that celebrated collective identity. These events were not merely expressions of tradition, but instruments of social cohesion, allowing individuals from diverse backgrounds to participate in rituals that affirmed their place within the Zulu state. The visual impact of synchronized movement and regimental regalia reinforced the perception of unity, both among participants and observers. Shaka's leadership style contributed significantly to the success of these efforts. He maintained a presence that combined accessibility with authority, participating in military activities while also presiding over judicial and administrative matters. This dual role reinforced the idea that the state was embodied in the person of the king, linking loyalty to the broader system with loyalty to its leader. His willingness to endure the same hardships as his warriors enhanced credibility, while his uncompromising expectations reinforced discipline. Centralization also required mechanisms for monitoring loyalty and preventing dissent. Shaka employed a network of informants and advisors who reported on conditions within different regions, allowing him to respond quickly to emerging threats or dissatisfaction. Chiefs were frequently reassigned or rotated to prevent the consolidation of independent power bases, ensuring that authority remained dependent on the central structure. While effective, these measures also contributed to an atmosphere of caution and vigilance, reflecting the challenges inherent in maintaining control over a rapidly expanding state. The meritocratic elements of Shaka's system further strengthened loyalty. Advancement within the military and administrative hierarchy depended on demonstrated competence rather than solely on lineage. Warriors who distinguished themselves in battle could achieve positions of influence, receive cattle, and gain social recognition. This emphasis on merit encouraged dedication while reinforcing the perception that the state offered opportunities unavailable within traditional clan structures. For individuals who had experienced marginalization or limited prospects, the Zulu system provided a pathway to advancement that fostered commitment. Economic organization also reflected the centralizing tendencies of Shaka's rule. As the Zulu kingdom expanded under Shaka's leadership, The effects of his military and political innovations began to extend far beyond the borders of his immediate territory. Victories that initially appeared localized started to generate ripple effects across southern Africa, reshaping patterns of settlement, triggering migrations, and altering the balance of power among communities that had never directly encountered the Zulu army. What began as the consolidation of a regional force gradually evolved into a period of widespread upheaval known in later historical narratives as the Mfecane, a term often translated as the crushing or the scattering. The Mfecane was not the result of a single battle or deliberate policy alone. It emerged from a combination of factors that converged during the early 19th century. Population pressures, environmental challenges, competition for resources, and the rise of centralized military states capable of projecting power across vast distances. Shaka's rapid expansion acted as a catalyst within this volatile environment. His victories destabilized existing alliances and forced neighboring communities to make urgent decisions about survival, often leading to displacement and conflict that spread far beyond the immediate reach of Zulu forces. When the Zulu army defeated a neighboring clan, the consequences extended beyond territorial change. Defeated groups faced difficult choices: assimilation, migration, or resistance in new locations. Many chose to flee, seeking safety in regions already occupied by other communities. These migrations introduced new tensions as displaced groups competed for land, water, and cattle. Communities that had previously lived in relative stability suddenly found themselves confronted by unfamiliar arrivals, whose desperation heightened the likelihood of conflict. Violence spread in waves, with each displacement creating further displacement, amplifying instability across the region. Refugee movements also carried stories. Accounts of the disciplined Zulu army, the devastating Buffalo Horns formation, and the relentless efficiency of close combat tactics traveled with migrating groups. These stories shape perceptions even in areas untouched by direct conflict, influencing how leaders assess threats and prepare defenses. Fear became a powerful force in its own right, encouraging preemptive action and strategic alliances aimed at avoiding the fate experienced by those already displaced. In this way, Shaka's influence extended through both physical encounters and psychological impact. Some displaced leaders responded not by seeking refuge, but by adapting. Former allies, rivals, or subordinates who had witnessed Zulu methods began to replicate aspects of Shaka's military organization within their own communities. They formed regiments, emphasized discipline, and adopted variations of close combat tactics designed to counter or emulate Zulu effectiveness. This process transformed displacement into innovation, as new states emerged shaped by lessons learned through conflict and survival. What is clear, however, is that Shaka's rise played a crucial role in accelerating processes that reshaped southern Africa during this period. Through expansion, assimilation, and the demonstration of disciplined military power, he influenced patterns of migration, state formation, and cultural exchange that continued to shape the region long after his own reign ended. The echoes of these transformations persisted in the identities, political structures, and historical memories of communities navigating a world irrevocably altered by the forces unleashed during this remarkable era. By the mid-1820s, Shaka stood at the height of his power. The Zulu kingdom had expanded dramatically. His army was feared across vast distances, and his authority appeared unquestionable. From scattered beginnings, he had forged a centralized state built on discipline, military precision, and psychological dominance. Yet beneath this image of strength, pressures were quietly accumulating. The system that had enabled rapid expansion depended heavily on continuous conquest, strict obedience, and the presence of a leader capable of maintaining absolute control. As external threats diminished and internal demands increased, the very foundations of Shaka's power began to strain. Expansion had created expectations that were difficult to sustain. Warriors who had spent years campaigning anticipated rewards: cattle, recognition, and eventual permission to marry and establish households. The economy, shaped by conquest and redistribution, relied on a steady flow of resources acquired through military success. As the number of easily conquerable neighbors declined, the opportunities for quick victories and abundant spoils diminished. Long-distance campaigns became more demanding and less profitable, placing pressure on both the army and the broader population responsible for supporting it. The rhythm of expansion, once a source of momentum, began to reveal its limitations. Within the kingdom, fatigue slowly replaced the enthusiasm that had characterized earlier years. Young men who had grown up within regimental settlements began to feel the weight of prolonged service without clear prospects for transition into civilian life. The discipline that had unified the army also delayed personal aspirations, creating tension between collective loyalty and individual desire. Chiefs, while outwardly obedient, sometimes struggled with the erosion of their autonomy and the increasing centralization of authority. These tensions did not immediately threaten stability, but they created an undercurrent of unease that required careful management. At the same time, Shaka's leadership style grew more intense. His success had reinforced the belief that discipline and uncompromising authority were essential to maintaining unity. As challenges became more complex, he responded by tightening control rather than relaxing it. Executions for perceived disloyalty or failure became more frequent, and the atmosphere within the royal court shifted toward heightened vigilance. What had once been a system balanced between fear and reward began to lean more heavily toward fear. Loyalty persisted, but increasingly carried an element of caution rather than genuine devotion. Paranoia gradually emerged as a defining feature of Shaka's later rule. Rapid expansion and the memory of earlier rivalries contributed to a perception that threats could arise from both external enemies and internal rivals. Informants and surveillance, already part of his governance strategy, became more prominent. Chiefs and commanders understood that success did not guarantee security, and proximity to power could invite suspicion as easily as favor. This environment discouraged open communication, as individuals hesitated to express concerns or offer alternative perspectives that might be interpreted as dissent. The turning point in Shaka's emotional and psychological stability came with the illness and death of his mother, Nandi, in 1827. Throughout his life, Nandi had represented resilience, loyalty, and the emotional anchor that sustained him through exile and humiliation. Her presence was intertwined with his identity, shaping both his determination and his understanding of personal connection. The loss was therefore not simply familial, but deeply symbolic, reopening wounds associated with childhood vulnerability and rejection. For a leader accustomed to exerting control over his environment, the inability to prevent her death was profoundly destabilizing. Shaka's response to this loss was immediate and extreme. He declared a period of mourning that extended far beyond customary practices. The kingdom was ordered into collective grief, with expectations that all subjects demonstrate visible sorrow regardless of personal connection to Nandi. Agricultural activities were disrupted, and consumption of milk, a staple resource, was restricted as a symbolic expression of mourning. These decrees, while intended to honor his mother, had significant practical consequences, contributing to food shortages and economic strain at a time when the population was already fatigued by prolonged campaigns. The mourning period also intensified the atmosphere of fear. Expressions of grief were closely scrutinized, and individuals perceived as insufficiently sorrowful faced punishment. The expectation that personal emotions conform to the king's grief created a climate in which authenticity was replaced by performance. Warriors and subjects alike were compelled to demonstrate loyalty through exaggerated displays of mourning, reinforcing the perception that personal security depended on the ability to anticipate and satisfy the king's emotional expectations. Mass executions during this period further destabilized the kingdom. Servants, advisors, and even individuals with tenuous connections to perceived offenses were punished, often without clear justification. The scale of violence shocked both contemporaries and later observers, transforming mourning into a period of terror. While some accounts may exaggerate specific numbers, the overall impact is widely acknowledged. Fear intensified, trust eroded, and the cohesion that had sustained Shaka's earlier successes began to fracture under the weight of unpredictable authority. Shaka's grief also manifested in military actions lacking strategic purpose. Raids were launched not for expansion or resource acquisition, but as expressions of rage and a desire to impose mourning on others. Warriors were ordered to attack communities already under Zulu influence, creating destruction that offered little tangible benefit. These campaigns confused soldiers accustomed to fighting for clear objectives, raising questions about the direction of leadership. While obedience remained intact, enthusiasm and conviction were increasingly replaced by resignation. Within the royal court, advisors found themselves unable to challenge Shaka's decisions. The fear of appearing disloyal discouraged honest counsel, leaving the king isolated within a circle of individuals who reinforced his perceptions rather than offering balance. This isolation deepened his emotional instability, creating a feedback loop in which paranoia and grief intensified without mitigation. The leader who had once relied on strategic clarity and calculated discipline now exhibited unpredictability that undermined confidence among those closest to him. The broader population experienced the consequences of this instability through disrupted livelihoods and heightened insecurity. Agricultural production suffered due to mourning restrictions, while ongoing executions created uncertainty about personal safety. Chiefs struggled to maintain order within their territories as directives from the center fluctuated, and the administrative efficiency that had characterized earlier years weakened. The centralized system that depended on Shaka's energy and oversight began to show signs of strain as his focus shifted from governance to personal anguish.